1970 back to Lahore, which was West Pakistan government, and then worked on the dissolution of one unit, West Pakistan government, and formation of the new provinces. And that was a very exciting work. I was working with people like M.M. Ahmad, Ghulam Isa Khan, A.G.N. Qazi. It was a very, very rewarding experience. So after the breakup of one unit, I was assigned to Sindh. And I was posted first in the administration department, where we organized the new government. But soon I was transferred to the planning and development department. And there I realized that my educational background is totally inadequate in order to carry out the responsibilities in planning and development. I had no background in economics, except that I studied some at the Civil Service Academy. So I applied for a scholarship to Williams College, although there were other civil servants who were economists, but I was lucky to be selected by the visiting interviewer, who was, very, very objective in his, and he said, okay, you can make up because you are a sciences student, you can make up. So I went to Williams College, and among the 25 other students who were all economists, I was the odd man out. I stood first in the class in my master's. So that ignited my interest in economics. And I came back, and then I applied for a Ford Foundation fellowship to do my PhD. And I was accepted by Stanford, Cornell, and Boston University. Boston said, we are the only people who do not have a minimum residency requirement, because my fellowship was for 18 months. So I went there, did my courses, preliminary exams, defended my proposal, came back to Pakistan, carried out a survey, wrote my dissertation, and I was very fortunate that I got my PhD. At that time, I came back to Pakistan, then there was an advertisement for a position in the World Bank. And I said, let me try for the World Bank. And there was a difficulty that establishment division said, you have just come back after 18 months of scholarship, you cannot go back. So I went to Aftab Ahmed Khan, who was my boss, and he was finance secretary. And he told Ghulam Isa Khan, this is internationally comparative position. If he doesn't get it, somebody else from other country will get it. So please give him 3 years leave. So I got 3 years leave. I applied. I was selected by the World Bank interview panel, and it was 21 years later that I came back to Pakistan, because it was very fascinating. I started as a junior economist. Soon I became the resident representative in Nigeria. Then I became a division chief. Then I became chief economist for Africa, and then chief economist of East Asia. Then I became the director of poverty and social departments in 21 years. So I said, I'm doing such interesting work, and I resigned from the civil service. Then came Musharraf government, and they approached me. I was in Almaty. I was approached by General Aziz, who was his chief of staff, that why don't you drop in Islamabad? We want to meet you. So I come to Islamabad. I was interviewed by 12 generals. And the next thing I know is that I was offered the job of the governor of the state bank. I didn't know any of the generals. I didn't know General Musharraf, because I've been away from the country. And 6 years I spent very fulfilling. I can tell you that was one of the most challenging jobs because of the sanctions after the nuclear. We were in pretty bad shape. $11 billion of deposits of residents and non-residents were frozen. We had military government, and the military government had sanctions, and our reserves were negative, not only positive but negative. But those 6 years, and go back on that question later on, but they were most fulfilling, and I have a job satisfaction that I was able to make a few, accomplishments for the country. I'll come back to the, and after I retired from the state bank, President Musharraf asked me that he wanted to reform the civil service. So he formed a commission, the National Commission for Government Reforms, and he appointed me the chairman of the commission. And I went from Dera Ismail Khan all the way to Gwadar and studied the whole governance structure of Pakistan for 2 years, along with my commission members, which included people like Shams Lakha, Shahid Kartar, Farooq Rahmatullah, Shafqat Jamod, Dr. Malik Kasi, and very eminent people. So we produced a report which was completed after President Musharraf's exit. And I presented it to Yusuf Raza Gilani, who was the new prime minister. And Mr. Gilani said, we are just so much involved in crisis management that we would take some time before we can even look at your report. So that was the report's end, and then nothing happened. And then I went to Woodrow Wilson Center, which is one of the leading think tanks in Washington, and I wrote this book, Governing the Ungovernable. By the way, the interest of the generals was that I had at that time written a book called The Economy of an Elitist State about Pakistan. And so that sparked their attention. And this book attracted the attention of Prime Minister Imran Khan. And so when he became the prime minister, he asked me that he would like to implement some of those reforms in Pakistan. Can I come and help him? So he appointed me advisor. So that is the background from my student days to the present. I think it was not Khalid Mirza, it was me who offered SECP to take over the non-banking financial institutions. And the reason was very simple. 95% of the financial assets were in the banking system. And we had two supervision departments, one banking and one non-banking. And we were not able to allocate adequate supervisory resources to look at our commercial banks. So I said, for 5%, I'm making 50% of my human resources available, which is not the right kind of thing for a central bank to do that. And I said, SECP is the agency, other regulatory agency, and they should take it over. Now, SMEs were never given loans, even by the NBFIs at that time. And during our time, if you look at the record and you have access to all the data, we reached 17% of the total loans for the SMEs. It is a pity that it has gone down now to 7%. We removed the mandatory ceilings on agriculture credit, and the private banks who have no presence in the rural areas, like Bank Halabib, Bank Al-Falah, Metropolitan Bank, they also lent money. It was only Zarai Tarakati Bank which used to give the money for agriculture. As the agriculture credit went up from almost 50 billion to 250, 300 billion, and when I left, it was 600, 700 billion. Consumer financing, for which I was criticized by your colleagues in the media, but if you don't have a demand for cars, for houses, for other consumer durables, how can you have economies of scale which will lead to investment, which will be productive, which will lead to manufacturing in the country? So that's a linkage between the demand and investment. And those are the kind of things I hoped that they would continue. The advanced deposit ratio at that time was in 70-75, which is now 45-50. And there was no, lending to the government because the government was not incurring high fiscal deficits. And during two times, we borrowed from the IMF. We completed all the conditionalities and returned the two tranches because we didn't need them. And we did what every country should do, is try to bring about fundamental structural changes. So I'm disappointed that at this time, the banks are not doing what they ought to be doing. They're just making money available to the treasury bills and the PIBs, which is not their job. Ali, there were some good governors also. I mean, Salim Raza was very good, Shahid Kardar.
But they were like for short period.
Yeah.
1 year or 1 year.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that the institution was very strong, but leadership does matter. And my ratio is 80-20. 80% is what the institution can do, and 20% depends on what the leader can do. So now, since the new governor has come in, the same people who were working in the state bank have turned around, and they are doing kind of things which nobody expected the state bank to do. They are in the leading edge as far as the technology is concerned. Look at the initiatives they have taken in many areas. For example, all the startups and the IT companies were complaining that they were having problems as far as the money transfers were concerned. Holding companies were not able to invest. They couldn't do anything. And the state bank did this. Very, very important initiative. And today the IT exports are actually picking up and become $2 billion. Similarly, look at the micropayment gateway, which is going to create a huge difference as far as all the payment regime is concerned in this country. Then Russian digital accounts, you can see how we are mobilizing the savings of the people overseas, Pakistanis. And so they are at the cutting edge, but the governor can provide the leadership, but it is the institutional strength which really enables him to do that. He cannot do it all by himself. So I still think that among all the institutions in Pakistan, and I've been away now for 15 years, I feel very gratified that the state bank still enjoys the best reputation among all the public sector institutions. People ask me, why were you able to turn around both the state bank as well as the IBA, which are public sector institutions? And why aren't you able to do this at the government of Pakistan? Remember, Ali, there are 4 million people working in the government of Pakistan, as compared to a few thousands which are working in the state bank and few hundreds who are working in the IBA. Secondly, I was a chief executive of both the institutions, where I had the authority and power to formulate the strategy and execute the strategy with the help of my team and other stakeholders. Both as the chairman of the National Commission and now advisor to the Prime Minister, I'm only providing the technical expertise, proposals in the form of reforms. The implementation is the responsibility of the line ministries. So if there is a reform for performance management system where the present system is totally rotten, it is the establishment division which has to completely change the whole guidelines, the procedures, and prescribe new procedures. I cannot do it. Similarly, I'm very successful as far as the finance is concerned, because there we got the public finance management law for the first time in the history of Pakistan, where the powers of the Ministry of Finance have been delegated to line ministries. How can you actually reconcile to the idea that there is a 22 grade officer who is sitting as the secretary and he has to rely on the dictates of a section officer of the Ministry of Finance? Right now, what we have done, you just give him a one-line budget and he doesn't have to go to the Ministry of Finance. He can do whatever he wants to allocate resources for the best use in order to get the value of money. So that reform itself will enable the secretary to fulfill his targets. That has been done. The whole financial advisor organization of FA, DFA, joint FA has been abolished. There is nothing like that. Like the corporate sector, we have introduced a chief finance officer in each ministry who reports to the secretary of the ministry and manages the finances. That reform, we have been able to do this. The third area where I got a lot of support from the Prime Minister and Hafiz Sheikh and now Shaukat Tareen was on the state-owned enterprises. There are 10 state-owned enterprises which are causing 89% of the annual losses, cumulative losses to the exchequer. So we prepared the restructuring plan for PIA, for Pakistan Railways, for Pakistan Steel Mills, for the DISCOs, and that is now, the plans have been approved by the cabinet, but it is up to the aviation ministry, the railway ministry, the energy ministry to implement those reforms. So that, I think, is the disconnect. Although the Prime Minister himself takes a lot of personal interest because he's very reform-minded, but it is the ministries which have to do this. The other, what I consider a very disheartening feature is that the provinces did not take part in the task forces which we have established on the reforms. They said, we are now quite autonomous after the 18th Amendment, and we will not follow what you are telling us because you remain confined to the federal government. We will do things on our own. And you know that the interaction of a common citizen for education, for health, for drinking water, for sanitation, for waste disposal, for public transport takes place at the local level, which the provincial governments are, responsible. So looking from my perspective, where civil service reforms and institutional reforms were intended to make the delivery of services, basic services, available to a common citizen who doesn't have the money or the connections, I'm frustrated because those reforms haven't taken place. We wanted security of tenure, that if you appoint a secretary or a head of a department, they should continue there for a certain period without being disturbed unless he's found guilty of corruption or any misconduct. But now you have too many frequent transfers in the ministries. They have no accountability at all. But in the federal government, one of the important things we have been able to accomplish, thanks to the Prime Minister, that all the appointments of the chief executives and the managing directors of the public sector, companies, corporations, statutory corporations, bodies are done in a transparent, open, comparative basis. And with the grace of God, we have been able to recruit 62 top-notch Pakistanis from both within the country and outside the country to these positions. These overseas Pakistanis who applied, I asked them the question, how come you're applying for this job, leaving your job in Hong Kong or Singapore or Dubai? They said, before this process, which is so transparent, we had no connections in Pakistan. We had no political affiliation. So why should we apply? Now everything is so open that people have left jobs in Wall Street, in Islamic Development Bank, and World Bank, and come and join the government of Pakistan organizations. And that, I think, is something which I'm very proud of. And that is because of the persistence of the Prime Minister, who said, I want all appointments to be done purely on merit. And he doesn't interfere in any one of these appointments. Although it is his discretionary power, he brings all the proposals before the cabinet, and the cabinet discusses each and every CV of the panel members who have been proposed in detail. And I think that is something that if you have the right man for the right job at the institution will improve. So there are some pluses and there are some minuses in this game. Now, I think it's a very complex issue, and it will take not 1 hour, many hours of conversation with you. But let me try to share some thoughts with you. Here is a Prime Minister who is really very sincere in his beliefs and in his doings, that the vision of Pakistan should be to liberalize the energies of the private individuals, businesses, farmers, professionals, without too much hindrances from the government to create wealth. And the part of this wealth should come to the government as tax revenues, and use those tax revenues in order to help the poor segments of the population and the backward areas. Now, this is a model of inclusive growth, which China and Eastern Asian countries have followed very successfully. The trick is that we have a constituency politics, and the priorities of an elected MPA and MNA is that he or she should be re-elected at the next election. And what are the contributory factors to his or her election? He should be able to spend funds for development projects in his constituency. He should be able to have the SHO and the Patwari and the Tehsildar of his choice so that he can get the work done. And this elitist model is a bargaining model where the people who have no connections find the intermediaries in the politicians, who then mediate on their behalf and get the basic services rendered to these individuals. In the bargain, they promise that at the time of the elections, we would vote for you. So you have this bargaining model of the intermediation by the politically connected people. So their priorities are not general economic well-being of Pakistan, but the well-being of their constituents. So they want jobs to be created, and if they are in a position of influence, they want their constituents to be appointed to those positions. So there's a conflict between the priorities of the elected representatives because of the compulsions of the constituency politics and the vision of a leader who is not thinking in a 5-year electoral cycle, but who is thinking in the long term. And you know, as an economist, that there is no congruence between the electoral cycle and economic development cycle. There is no congruence at all. what you need to do is a continuity, predictability, and consistency in economic policies. But unfortunately, in Pakistan, we see with the change in the government, we have complete reversal of even some of the good policies. And this creates an unpredictability. No, you can modify this, like you have women's seats and technocrats seats in the Senate. Egypt has a constitutional arrangement where 50% of the seats are constituency contested, and the 50% are given in proportional representation to the votes which are received by the political parties. And there were more than 100 PhDs in science and agriculture, in various subjects, who were given tickets in the proportional representation to the assembly. They become members of the National Assembly, and they also become the resources for running the ministries. And that, when they run the ministry, they're looking at the larger picture because they are not elected by a particular constituency. They are over and above the political considerations of appeasing their constituents, while they have subject matter knowledge. So it's this combination of subject matter knowledge without being beholden to their constituency creates an optimal result. Well, I want to be a little bit more, flexible. This is a very straitjacket, assignment for me. And the Prime Minister is very, very tough. He doesn't take any leave himself, and he doesn't want anybody else to go on leave. I have my, grandchildren scattered in various continents, and they always complain that I don't spend much of time. So besides reading, writing, going on some boards, I would have more flexibility to spend time. Even before I joined the government, I was very fortunate that I used to be invited at the international conferences and fora. In 2017, I attended, according to my assistant, 17 international conferences all over the world. So I would be doing that, hopefully, and that gives me a great deal of pleasure. And I will continue to have interaction with the media, with the think tanks, with the educational institutions, with the cultural institutions, which I'm very interested in: art, culture, poetry. So those are the things. Watch cricket matches anywhere they are being held. So that's what I want to do.